plenary session number 5. So good to see you. A very wise professor told me quite recently that if there was a silver lining, a benefit, a plus that came out of COVID from his perspective, because he's a professor of logistics, he said it's raised the profile of logistics and supply chain management. Only at TT could I hear that sentence and that positivity. Hello, plenary members. Nice to see you. I'm going to say hello to all of you, and you are going to introduce yourself to our delegates around the world. Wise Professor Alan, tell everybody who you are and what you do.
Okay, thanks, Femi. I'm Alan McKinnon. I'm a professor of logistics at the Kuehne Logistics University in Hamburg, which we think is the world's only logistics university. It's just enjoyed its 10th anniversary. I've been an academic in this field for 42 years, specializing in my teaching and research on transport and logistics. And in that time, I've had a chance to study many aspects of the subject, but much of my recent work has been on the decarbonisation of logistics. So I'm sure that's a topic that will come up during our conversations.
I'm sure it will. Hello, Margi. Tell everybody who you are, what you do. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you, Femi. Thank you very much. So my name is Margi van Gogh, and I have the pleasure of leading the transport and supply chain initiatives at the World Economic Forum. As a member of the mobility platform, our work on the platform really focuses on accelerating this global transition to a safer, cleaner, more inclusive transportation system where we can harness new technologies and drive more equitable access to mobility, both for people and for goods. And my experience really resides in plus 20 years in the supply chain arena across multiple sectors, and I'm thrilled to join you this afternoon. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Hello, Tom. What do the delegates need to know about you? Welcome.
Thank you, Femi. Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening. Tom Omagu, International Community Relations Manager with the Antwerp Port Authority. In this capacity, I maintain relations with a number of international institutions and port organizations across the globe. My professional background situates in communications, politics, international affairs, and a little bit of digitalization. And I was among the contributors to the IPH World Bank paper on accelerating digitalization.
It's great to have your expertise in the mix. And Lance, nice to see you. What do the delegates need to know about you? Welcome to TT.
Thank you, Femi. My name is Lance Kaneshiro, and I'm the Chief Information Officer of Los Angeles. The Port of Los Angeles is the busiest container port in the United States. In IO, I oversee the Information Technology Division, which includes cybersecurity. And our goals include leveraging technologies to improve operational efficiencies, as well as support the Port of Los Angeles's digitalization strategies. I also serve as co-chair for the Cyber Resilience Working Group for the Chainport Group, which includes leading ports from around the world. And thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Happy to have you. So, delegates, Lance, Tom, Margi, Alan is going to do a scene setter. Wherever he says something that just makes your eyebrows raise, makes your head click up, let me know. Chat to me, delegates, and plenary speakers. We'll get back to you in just a moment. Alan, over to you.
Thank you very much. If I can have my presentation, please. Thank you very much. Hopefully you can all see that. Okay, so my intention here is really to flag up a series of issues that we can debate in a bit more detail during the plenary. And my starting point is some work we actually did with the World Economic Forum some years ago when we tried to identify what we thought were the main supply chain megatrends. We identified 7 of them, you can see on that slide. I revisited that work recently to see what effect the COVID pandemic is likely to have had on them. And I think in every case, it is likely to have reinforced and accelerated those trends. and I'm going to talk about each of them in a bit more detail. And most of the arrows, as you can see, have gone up the way. The one that's gone in the opposite direction is logistics skill shortages, because it seems to me that what's happened recently could help to address the shortage of talented people in the logistics sector. Now, a question I'm often asked is why so few companies were prepared for the pandemic, because it has proved very disruptive of companies' supply chains. Because after all, we've had about 20 years of research and debate and conferences on supply chain resilience. There are examples of reports from consultancy companies, and in addition to that, there's been an explosion in academic research on supply chain resilience. So why were we not better prepared for the pandemic? Well, I've got some sympathy with businesses because, my clicker doesn't seem to be working. I'll just go back. That's awesome. Yeah. I think COVID-19 is an outlier. It's an extreme event. It goes beyond the bounds of most companies' contingency planning. And I think it's understandable. It's more a matter for governments, it seems to me, to prepare for pandemics than it is for individual companies. But nevertheless, companies have had to react to the crisis. And a reaction that many have had is the feeling that they should be reversing the process of globalization. They should be shortening their supply lines in an effort to make their supply chains more robust. Now, again, we've had many years of debate as to how long globalization is going to continue and the likelihood of it going into reverse with companies reshoring or nearshoring their production. But there's not much evidence of reshoring happening, even before the crisis. Kuehne, for example, have an index they use in the US to measure the degree of reshoring. And over the 10-year period from 2008 to 2018, there was only 1 year where they could find there was a net reshoring of manufacturing activity. The OECD in 2016 did a substantial review of reshoring, and they did suggest that it was likely to develop to a greater extent. In April last year, just as the epidemic was gathering pace, there was a survey done of a large sample of managers of multinational companies, asking them if they were contemplating reshoring or nearshoring their operations. And as you can see, 83% of them said yes to that. But when the survey was redone 6 months later, that percentage had more than halved. So the initial response, I think, was maybe a panic reaction, maybe a knee-jerk reaction. And then once companies had time to reflect on it and to see what the effect of the pandemic was on their operations, they decided to change their mind on that subject. And there's also been a lot of discussion of this in the press. These are articles in the Financial Times, for example. And a major theme here has been cautioning companies against thinking that because of the pandemic, we should simply put globalization into reverse. I think for a number of reasons. Partly because of the very complex interaction between the pandemic and all the longer-term geopolitical and environmental trends. Also because localizing production and sourcing doesn't necessarily minimize your supply chain risk. I mean, if you base all your production in a single country, that itself can also be risky. And the other reason is that it's possible to reduce risk to supply chains and improve resilience, even of lengthy supply chains, in other ways. Because there's what I call the supply chain resilience toolbox, the whole range of things that companies can do to reduce the risk of disruption to their supply chains. And I'm sure you're well familiar with this. Right at the top is agility, making our supply chains more resilient, but also things like relaxing just-in-time pressures, building up more inventory, reducing complexity, perhaps rationalizing product portfolios, moving from single to multiple sourcing. Another thing which has been discussed much recently, for example, in this World Economic Forum report with Kuehne, suggesting that maybe companies could be diversifying their supply bases regionally and then strengthening the intercontinental connections between these regional hubs. And Sorry for the delay. However, I make the point that there's no one size fits all here. I mean, the resilience strategy that's adopted, I think, has to be customized to a particular company, a sector, a commodity group. And I think that's well exemplified in the case of medical supply chains, because many governments, having been caught out by the pandemic, it seems to me, will want to protect themselves. Because this isn't the last pandemic we're going to suffer. The World Health Organization recently said that the big one is still to come, which is deeply worrying. So it seems to me that many companies will probably want to build up their national stocks of PPE and ICU equipment. Many will want to retain some production capacity in this area. They will probably want to strengthen their international liaison with other organizations. And the other thing which we're going to have to do in the next year is hugely build up the cold chain capacity worldwide to handle the distribution of vaccines. And once that is in place, it will also benefit the movement of other temperature controlled products as well. There are a number of other important trends, I think, which are being accelerated by COVID. One is digitalization. I'm using that as the collective term for a whole range of IT and computing and artificial intelligence developments, some of which are now well established in logistics. Others, like the use of AI, for example, Internet of Things, digital twinning, are only just beginning. Now, there's no question that these things are going to be transformational. We did a survey of 90 senior executives in Europe recently and in logistics, and the vast majority of them thought that digitalization will be transformational in logistics over the next 5 years. And that's a mature market for digitalization. In 2020, only about 5% of venture capital in logistics innovation was spent in Europe. 40% of it was spent in the APAC region, in Asia Pacific region, where at the moment that's proving a very fertile bidding ground for logistics innovation and startups. And that, again, is going to have a huge effect on freight transport and logistics in those areas. Also have to say something about 3D printing. Many people are predicting that in the longer term, that will be transformational. It will cause a major reconfiguration of companies' value chains. 3D printing is considered to have had a good crisis, a good COVID crisis. There was a paper published in Nature looking at how the range of 3D applications has hugely extended recently. But there's still a lot of debate as to what its longer term effects will be on the supply chain, which there's a delay effect here with my clicker, unfortunately. Yeah, the 3D printing will streamline supply chains. It will probably have the effect of reducing the amount of freight movement, may actually help with the process of decarbonisation, but as I say, a lot of uncertainty on that subject. And then we can look at other trends which are being accelerated. One obvious one is the growth of online retailing. You can see the projections there for the huge increase in the growth in online retail sales, which is transforming logistics in many ways. It's become international, so it's affecting international trade. Huge impact on the last mile, particularly within urban areas. Huge impact on the commercial property market. And it's also got major employment impacts as employment is shifting from conventional retailing into online fulfillment of retail orders. Supply chain collaboration. Again, there's a lot of evidence that under the stresses of the pandemic, companies have been more willing to work with their partners to share logistics assets. For example, I cite the example here of one supply chain collaboration here in the UK where I'm based. But the question is, to what extent will these crisis-driven collaborations endure once we return to some level of normality? And then I think there's an important employment dimension to all of this. As Femi mentioned earlier, I think one of the benefits of COVID, there are very few benefits, is it has raised the profile and the status of logistics and supply chain management, which I think is highly desirable. The other good thing is that many people working in logistics have been deemed to be essential workers, because in the past, during pandemics, lorry drivers, truck drivers, for example, have been seen as a pandemic vector transmitting the disease. Thankfully, there's a much more positive view of logistics employment this time round. But things that may happen, some people feel this will accelerate the automation of logistics processes to make them less vulnerable in the future to future pandemics. there'll be a need for us to make our logistics infrastructure more pandemic resilient. And I think I have to also say something about the human crisis of the large number of seafarers who've been stranded on board ships around the world. I think that figure peaked in September last year when there were over 400,000 seafarers who were stranded. And then moving on to sorry, just I'll open up this slide. The effects on the environment. As I mentioned earlier, my main field of research is the decarbonisation of logistics. The International Transport Forum estimated that during the period of maximum COVID confinement in April and May last year, there was about a 30% reduction in CO2 emissions from freight transport worldwide by all transport modes. Now, the ITF also has a scenario, a high ambition scenario, that would see emissions from freight transport drop by 30% by 2030. So in 2 months, we achieved what was a 15-year target. But of course, in the meantime, the global economy has rebounded, and with it, freight traffic volumes and emissions. But if we look at the targets for reducing freight emissions, a high ambition scenario of the International Transport Forum would see freight emissions rise by 20% between 2015 and 2050. But we're going to have to try and get to net zero emissions from freight transport by then. So the question is, to what extent has the COVID crisis put us on the right trajectory to get to that net zero target for freight transport? Well, I've got here my optimistic and pessimistic scenarios. The optimistic low carbon scenario would see supply chain restructuring now, which maybe would localize more sourcing, would tend to relax just-in-time pressures, allowing us to make better use of freight capacity. At a government level, it would be nice if this led to some withdrawal of fossil fuel subsidies, which is artificially making freight transport cheap in many countries, and carbon pricing. And also under that heading, I mean, if we had greater digitalization, as is likely, move to the circular economy, 3D printing, those things together could help to drive down carbon emissions from freight transport. On the other hand, in my high carbon scenario, the danger is that companies and governments now prioritize debt reduction and rebuilding employment and so forth, and that will be prioritized over climate action. The danger is too that heavily indebted companies and governments just won't have the resources to invest in green logistics activities, and the danger is that logistics decarbonisation will be marginalised. Just to end, however, on a positive note, the survey that I mentioned earlier that we did in Europe with 90 senior executives asked them the question, how will COVID affect your logistics decarbonisation plans? And the vast majority of them said it either would not affect them at all or would affect them positively. So I think that's quite a nice message on which to end. So I hope you find that of interest. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alan. Margi, what stood out for you? Was there a moment where you thought, I get this scene setter, this is the bit that speaks to me in particular?
Well, thank you, Femi. I think Ellen is always, extremely insightful and always based on, the thoughts of others. I think when one looks at speaking to CEOs these days and recognizing that nobody has a glass ball and nothing has taught us that more than this pandemic, at which we've had to be extremely agile in our own capabilities to adopt digital technology. But I think what's clear here is the role that human beings play in making choices about, one, the assessment of risk, two, what we can do about it, and three, how we prioritize the investments in technologies that will enable us to address those risks. And those investments are not only financial, they come from collaboration. So I think when we look at the question that Alan posed is, will that collaboration be sustained beyond this pandemic? I think we can certainly hope that it would, because ultimately building a trust-based environment that enables us to adopt technology is going to require that collaboration.
Tom, for you, what stood out?
Yeah, actually, for me, is the fact that digitization has helped us through the pandemic. So in Antwerp, for example, because of the digitization, we were able to duplicate our command and control centers in 24 hours, so to make sure that we could assure port staff to operate in a safe environment. The other part is that, for example, there was a local company that had developed a number of wearable devices to allow dockers to work in a 1.5 meter social distance. So we strongly believe that digitization will be the future and will help us to overcome future pandemics if they are coming.
Lance, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that, thank you, Alan. That was a great presentation. I agree that collaboration is going to be key going forward. I did have a question in one of your opening statements regarding how I think you mentioned few companies were prepared for the pandemic. Relative to that, did you see that there was somewhat of a digital divide between companies that had already started with digitization efforts being more prepared than those that had not?
Will I respond to that? Yeah, that's an excellent point. I mean, if we look at the freight forwarding world, for example, many of the sort of legacy freight forwarding companies that are not properly digitized, still using a lot of paper-based systems, heavily labor-intensive, a lot of staff, they had a big problem. Whereas the digital forwarders, that have automated a lot of these processes, came out of this much better. So, I mean, just to reiterate the points that you both made about how those companies which had digitized to a greater extent are the ones which I think have come out of this much better. And I expect it set a good example to other businesses that have been rather slow to digitalize. They now realize this is the way forward.
Right.
So I think I would fully agree with the point you've made, Lance. Yeah, thank you.
Can I add something, actually, to what the professor says? Because it's not only businesses, it's also authorities that had an important lesson by working more digital and going away from the paper environment they were used to, customs, for example.
Yes, exactly.
I would love to hear. I would love to hear examples from your different areas of work about how the pandemic has pushed digitization. It was already happening, but what was the push? What are you seeing that it's advanced? Let's start with Tom, Port of Antwerp.
Actually, in the beginning, we saw kind of a reluctance for people working from home, right? And now everybody embraces the fact that we can all work from home, thanks to digitization and thanks to having a kind of a visionary management on how we should roll out this digital system. So, yeah, it was really a push for port staff to accept the fact that they could work from home.
Well, what were the reasons they were giving for, I can't do this from my house?
Actually, these reasons are now popping up. They are missing their colleagues now, right? So they lack the social contact. So these kind of things. So we're now in a kind of a second phase. So I think we should look into that, and also the mental well-being of our colleagues. Not everyone has the pleasure of the joy of living together with a family, for example. This requires special attention.
Yeah, Lance, for Port of LA, again, I'm thinking about the impact of COVID on the work you were already doing in digitization. And also, you belong to numerous groups, numerous ports, and you are seeing also what they're doing too. Can you share some examples of this impact on digitalization and COVID and ports?
Sure. I think that there are twofold. The digitization side, where, as Tom had mentioned, there's greater acceptance of digital tools that in large part had already existed, but there wasn't as much acceptance. I mean, even simple things, for example, such as this video conference. In the past, it was much more of a meet in person sort of environment, but this has become more accepted. You have more tools within your organization. Also, there's greater across the supply chain as data is being shared. And on the other side, there's also some that's where the area of cybersecurity comes into play as some of these digital tools get rolled out. That has also risen in importance and visibility. So looking at both sides, we need to balance those. With the other ports that I'm involved with, in Port of Antwerp, and Tom and his colleagues are also part of Chainport. We actually put together a paper last September on how digital tools were leveraged in crisis management And a large part of that includes examples from the ports of Antwerp, Los Angeles, Hamburg, Barcelona, Montreal, and the tools that we used in response to the crisis.
If people are not going to read the paper immediately, do you want to give us a little clue as to the
Right.
tools that you used? A little
So,
teaser.
sure. So one of the more interesting tools, I should say, was our port optimizer solution, which is a data collaboration tool to improve supply chain efficiencies. What we did was take some of that, a subset of that, into what we called the port, or not, I'm sorry, not port optimizer, but the medical optimizer, which took some of that data to help match suppliers of PPE equipment to those organizations that were in need of them to help facilitate that flow of goods through our port. So that medical optimizer supported a larger citywide initiative called Los Angeles Victory LA, which had that purpose. And actually, our executive director, Jean Soroka, was also named the chief Los Angeles to head up that Love LA project using our tools that we had at our port.
I feel without digitalization, I can see that Margi is making notes. Margi, share your note with me.
Well, I think what's really interesting about what's been shared here, from Alan and the perspective from two major ports that are responsible for a significant volume of global trade, is that when you take a look at the companies who use the ecosystem of transport, many, for 2 decades at least, companies have optimized supply chains, primarily, to drive efficiency, and they've used year over year cost reduction as a metric for what success looks like. The COVID pandemic is amongst several events in the past years that have led to a changing risk profile. I mean, we're talking a lot about the pandemic, but there have been trade tensions, there have been climate-related disruptions on an extreme scale. And I think recently the McKinsey Institute found that as many as 45% of 1 year's earnings could be lost every decade due to these types of disruptions. So companies that are demonstrating flexible and resilient supply chains can deliver far greater productivity improvement. But more important, this is not only about productivity improvement, it is about environmental and societal impact. Because we all know that companies that are more profitable are usually the ones that are the leaders in terms of doing what is not just profitable, but what is right for the planet.
Let me just bring in this question. This is from Jonathan. Jonathan is watching our plenary session. Thanks, Jonathan. Will flexible infrastructure, such as ports that can quickly and cheaply change capacities for certain types of movement as demand evolves, play an important role in more resilient supply chains? Who wants to tackle that first of all?
Shall I go?
Tom,
I
go
think
ahead.
actually, I think actually that ports, and especially major ports such as LA and Antwerp, aren't really flexible infrastructures, because planning a port project, actually it's a long-lasting infrastructure. So what we can do is actually we should be able in flexible operations to make sure that these key walls, that they can be used for different commodities, for example, but not the infrastructure itself.
Yeah,
I
I'd like.
yes, Lance.
I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, I would agree with Tom. I think that there's also other ways of improving that would be through, again, collaboration. So, for example, sharing data across the supply chain, which could help all the parties, and there are many parties along the supply chain, better prepare with more advanced, more accurate, more complete information that they can then use in their operations. Providing that visibility, I think, would help as well.
Margi, you're nodding your head.
I couldn't agree more. I think, the forum is engaged with, multiple initiatives with partners in cross-sectoral environments, and fully endorses the need for supply chain sector, particularly to drive digital transformation. And fostering, more global supply system visibility is technically feasible. It just requires trust and collaboration. This word keeps popping up, but trust and collaboration and the involvement of industry actors, international bodies, and governments. And the reality is that when we look at accelerating the adoption of 21st century technology and encouraging the aggregation of some elements of private and public sector data, this can lead to significant common good outcomes and the safe and sustainable and certainly inclusive facilitation of global trade, which is ultimately what we need to achieve if we don't want a continuing divide between the global north and the global south.
Alan, you look like you're thinking. Go ahead and articulate those thoughts.
Yeah, I was going to introduce a new topic into this discussion. I mean, because in terms of flexibility, I mean, during the pandemic, we came close in a few countries to exhausting all the available warehouse space. So here in the UK, for example, because demand dropped dramatically during the period of lockdown, but there was a large amount of in-transit inventory in containers coming from the Far East. They hit the port system in the UK, and we almost had no place to store all of that inventory. If one looks globally at oil, we were within 2 or 3 weeks of exhausting all the capacity to store oil, because the demand for oil dropped much more steeply than the production of oil. Now, I think this is the first time we've ever been in a situation where we've almost exhausted logistics capacity. But I mean, hopefully this is a one-off and won't be in this position again, but at least has shown to companies that this is possible, and therefore encourages them to build a bit of extra capacity, a bit of extra redundancy into the system. Now, there's a cost associated with that, but in the event of a disruption of this sort, it can actually save you, if when things come to the worst.
Could I just build on that?
Yeah, Margi and then Tom.
Sorry, thank you. I mean, Alan, I think you raise an incredibly important point, and just to give another illustration of that, I mean, we're speaking with a number of partners in the supply value system around vaccine distribution, and the vaccine rollout requires coordinated arrival of doses as they get produced, but along with peripherals, and the need to have those peripherals there is paramount to administering those doses. We've also seen, to your point about a shortage of warehouse space, the backlog that resulted in that came from China has resulted in an acute shortage of containers related to those early bottlenecks. And vaccine rollout is presently at risk in many countries, particularly in the global south, as a result of that massive swing that you just alluded to, with a 20% drop off and then a 30% demand. And we've got containers in the wrong places, but we have very limited visibility of where they are. So it's challenging to be able to identify rerouting.
That's right, which has seen a threefold increase in the average cost of moving containers. If one looks at the Freightos Container Index, 2 years ago it was like $1,500 per container movement. Today it's over $4,000, and it's partly the result of the situation you've just described, Margi. It's true.
So,
sorry,
Professor,
Tom, I
I'm going to
interrupted.
bring in. Sorry, Tom and then Lance, and then I'm going to bring in Richard Humphreys, who is watching you. Thanks, Richard. Stand by with your question. Go ahead, Tom.
Professor McKinnon, I just want to know, what was the effect of the Brexit on that warehouse shortage? Because actually it was a double impact. We saw from a port perspective that already a lot of UK companies were increasing their stocks in the UK itself. So they were already occupying this normally free warehouse space.
Yes, that's true. That there have been episodes of stockpiling because there were, I think, 3 potential dates when there would be a no-deal Brexit, if you like, when the country would go over a cliff. And so companies were preparing for that. And so they stockpiled, which occupied a lot of the warehousing space as well. So okay, the UK is in a rather unusual situation. In addition to all the COVID pressures, it's had the huge disruption of Brexit to deal with as well. So I really sympathise with supply chain managers based in the UK. They have had a lot of problems. Just one other thing I can maybe mention, the bullwhip effect. Much research by academics, where you get a disturbance of the supply chain at the front end, often an increase in demand. And then that effect is amplified as it works its way back along the supply chain. So that Brexit has had this bullwhip effect, but so too has the pandemic, which is destabilizing supply chains and upstream production operations. And I think it's going to take us some time for that effect to wear down.
Lance, go ahead.
Yeah. I think this builds upon Alan's mention of the cost of the resilience. My perspective is from the technology side, so I'm a big proponent of digitalization. In our view, the cost of the digital tools is a fraction of the cost of what the physical tools would be. In the past, resilience may be achieved by redundancy on the physical side, but with digital tools to assist in sharing and collaboration, the cost of that would be a fraction of what the physical redundancy would be.
Lance, I'm so glad you mentioned that. Hold tight, because I want to put Richard Humphrey's point to you. And it's a very good point. It's something I've been thinking of since we started this conversation. Can the panel comment on the risks and implications of a digital divide for the global south? Lance, you're speaking from the global north, and you love tech. And there's a lot to talk about with digitization. Meanwhile, the global south is listening to this thinking, what are we supposed to do? Lance, you start first.
Can you repeat that question, please? Yeah.
The digital south, the digital divide, being left behind. And I say this from your purview because you're in organizations that look at ports all over the world. Are you hearing from ports in the global south, your colleagues in the global south, being left behind? Do you even, is that even on your radar?
I think that when we look at digitalization, there's certainly those that have already started the process and others that have not. I think in the absence of digitalization, I apologize for coming back to collaboration, but I think that can be done as a start without the digital tools, and then from there build upon that collaboration with digitalization. But that's a start. I think every port can start with that point.
I'm just thinking, Margi, from the World Economic Forum, their awareness of this digital divide and what they are recommending that countries do. What have you seen countries do? And Lance, never apologize for collaboration, never, ever. Margi, go ahead.
It's an excellent question. And I think from the forum's perspective, there are a number of initiatives ongoing. If one takes Africa, for example, there's a significant difference between countries that are at the forefront of recognizing what adoption of digital technology can mean for their citizens and therefore keeping those politicians in power, of course. So when one looks at a country like Rwanda, which has, absolutely taken on collaboration with countries where the learning from employing cross-border systems that enable, pre-clearance, that, start looking at the adoption of, relatively still nascent technology for sure. But when one looks at blockchain and the impact that blockchain technology can have, there are countries, and it is country specific, that are looking at this. I think we have some hope that the African Union is sharing some of the insights with other countries in Africa, but there's still a lot more that can be done. And the reality is that the adoption of technology that allows digitization and transformation is a trade facilitator. It also has the wonderful outcome of reducing corruption, or at least making corruption far more transparent, which also acts a little bit as a handbrake depending on which side of the fence you're sitting on.
Tom?
Yes, actually, I just would like to echo what Margi says. The fact is that there is, for this ports in the south, actually, they have a huge advantage. They can take lessons that we have learned from the recent past, how to prepare investments. What's the cost of technology? It's all getting cheaper and cheaper, and most of these ports are smaller, so actually they can take a big leap forward with rather small investments. And actually, as a port, we are sharing our knowledge and our insights in that in these issues or in these matters on a weekly basis. We train staff from across the globe, especially from the south, in Antwerp or in Africa itself, how to make better use of port infrastructure.
Yes, Alan, go ahead.
Yeah, this doesn't relate specifically to ports, but looks at the application of digital logistics in the developing world. This morning, I moderated a session in my university's Logistics Innovators Day, and I heard wonderful case studies from companies that are transforming their freight markets. One in India, Freight Tigers. In Indonesia, there's a company called Wearsix. In Nigeria, there is Kobo 16. Now, these aren't just online freight exchanges. I mean, these are whole digital ecosystems with huge ambitions, to reform trucking operations mainly in these countries. They have got the capability to do it. They're getting a lot of engagement. And they, I think, would compare in their capabilities with some of the best companies we have in digital logistics in Europe. And then just one final thing. I mean, the question came from Richard. I would commend to everybody a report which he co-authored. It's a World Bank IAHP report on digitalization of ports. So yeah, that's an advert for his work.
Richard's asking a question that he already knows the answer to. We know we're at a World Bank session. All right, so I have looked at the website for the Port of Antwerp, and in big red letters it says Smart Port. I am fascinated, Tom, by how you would define what makes a port smart.
First of all, I think there is no real official definition of what a smart port is. I think every port tries to make his own model. But I can give you a number of elements or characteristics that should be part of that definition. First of all, that port should be a port with a digital nervous system. It should measure in an automated way a high number of parameters and assets and combine these results in an intelligent way. And all this with the aim to increase operational efficiency, to increase energy use, efficient energy use, to make sure that people are working safe in the port, to promote fluid cargo flows. So that makes a smart port actually to be connected as an ecosystem connected to other ecosystems, being authorities, being private companies. So it's being connected, measure,
Lance,
and use these results in an intelligent way.
Lance, have you seen the Port of Antwerp? Have you been there?
I have not been there. I do. I am in several groups with several Port of Antwerp colleagues, but I've not been to the port itself.
I'm just wondering, is the Port of Antwerp's obviously, I'm wondering if the Port of Antwerp is smarter than the Port of Los Angeles. How would you judge that? Where are you in terms of cutting edge technology?
My question?
That's for Lance.
Oh, for me? Okay. I think as Tom mentioned, I think that there's no definition of what port is. So I think each is appropriate for what their operation is. So I can't really say we can compare what one definition is versus the other. I think it's what's appropriate for their port.
Something that didn't come up, Alan, and I was listening very hard, so forgive me if you mentioned it and I didn't hear it. Cybersecurity, as we're talking about digitization, there's an issue with cybersecurity that is probably more prevalent now than it ever has been before. Lance, this is your passion, right? What do we need to be thinking about as we think about the stresses on logistics and then the future?
That certainly is an area of interest for me. As we work towards digitalization, I think we need to look at cybersecurity as an equal partner in that. I don't think you can have one or the other, because digitalization will be great for us being able to do new things, achieving efficiencies, but comes a lot of cyber risks, of course. With the more technologies that are installed, there'll be more exposure, more of an attack surface. With more connectivity, there's more ways for threat actors to come in. And even with innovation, with innovation comes new and really unknown risks that we need to be aware of. So, cybersecurity and digitalization, I think, need to go hand in hand as we move forward.
I'm going to bring in a question here. This is just coming from Gregory Mungle, and it takes us back to where we are right now, which is about the COVID-19 vaccine supply chains. So he's wondering about handling present challenges, increased pressures for demand. How well is it going to be facilitated? What are the pillars considered to identify a path to move forward? Margie, do you mind starting with that one?
It's a big question, but thank you. I think when one looks at the current situation and the value chain of upstream right through to downstream, tip of the needle, literally in the arm, that value chain, what is really vital here is visibility. And transparency. Not least, we talk about cybersecurity, but we also need to think about the impacts of has the product been handled safely, given the extreme differences from one vaccine to another in terms of the cold chain management. And I think Alan alluded to this a little bit earlier when we talked about, a warehouse space. Do we have sufficient cold chain space to enable the safe movement and then storage of that product before it enters the human body? So as we start to look at, transparency, traceability, and the need for interoperability across the value chain, this is where some of the more nascent technologies come in. And it's really interesting to see how many organizations are now starting to look at blockchain, for example, as a potential solution. I mean, the result is that when we look at a perfect supply chain management platform, it really has two key requisites for building digital trust. It has to be owned by nobody with a commercial interest. It rather has to provide this generic sort of standardized protocol that all participants in that value chain can join and share relevant data in. And it has to be unchangeable or immutable. Therefore, I mean, the information cannot be deleted, it can't be changed, it can only be appended, right? So consequently, that drives a higher level of accountability by each participant who's writing this data in. And if we have a look at the vaccine value chain, we really do need to think not just about the containers that are necessary in order to move the peripherals, but we need to think about all the players along that value chain who are going to be carrying, handling, or administering that vaccine at some point or other. And then we need to think about one other element. We've talked about greening of supply chains, right? Circularity, reverse logistics. How are we going to deal with this massive volume of waste that's resulting from these plastic peripherals, these needles, these swabs, these glass bottles, the packaging that's needed for use and reuse? And I think that's something worth considering.
Have you got suggestions? Have you got ideas?
Well, I think there are a number of projects that are now in very early stage looking at this. There's a lot of collaboration across the value chain. And when we look again at digitization and the value of it, it's this ability to move from a lack of visibility, a lack of transparency to, ultimately the holy grail for resilience is agility. And agility requires transparency and visibility. In order to achieve that, we're going to start to need to accelerate the adoption of digital technology. And digital technology on its own, in isolation, is not going to give us the answer. So data sharing communities are going to be necessary. And here I think that both Tom and Lance can probably speak very eloquently, as can Alan, to the number of digital communities that are being established in the maritime environment in order to ensure sharing of data, common standards. And I think the IPCSA is doing a lot of work in this arena. And here we can talk to African countries that are really leading the way and demonstrating what's possible. I think, Tom, we spoke last year about Morocco and what they were doing. So I think there is a lot that can be adopted. It's a question of how can we accelerate that adoption and ensure that there's shared learning.
Tom, pick up.
So the two keywords are here: trust and the will to share, right? So as said earlier, I think there is a big advantage for smaller ports across the globe to make minor investments and to make sure that they are capable of receiving this flow of medical supplies whenever they need it in the near future.
Lance, any thoughts on the COVID-19 vaccine supply chain?
No, but yeah, I'll just echo Tom's comments there. So trust, and willing to share. That's where I think, part of that collaboration will be the first step, and that from there you can overlay the digital tools to help it be done quickly, faster, and more completely.
I want to use the last section, the last 10 minutes of our plenary to look ahead, to look at future trends, to look at where you in your various different fields are actually maybe trend setting. There was something that you told me earlier this week, Tom, about the health of a port connected to the health of the economy. Will you repeat that and then build on
Yeah.
that?
Yes, of course. Actually, and I think Professor McKinnon will confirm that ports across the globe are seen as economical barometers. So whenever a port is doing well, global economy is doing well. So we are actually indicators of an economic situation or an economic status. So that's actually the example that I used. We're a barometer. We will show the world that the economy is on a slope downwards before actually people start feeling it.
So when we look at that for future trends, so if the ports are not doing well, then the economy is not doing well. So that means that Antwerp, the port of Antwerp, is not doing well right now.
Actually, I think all ports have been suffering a bit from the COVID crisis, and I must say that Antwerp, in the end, we did not that bad. We only lost 3 or 4%, I think. Some other ports in Europe they had bigger losses, and we're not happy for that. It's just a matter of fact.
Lance,
So
something
I think
very, very
global economy
thing.
will.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah. 'Cause go ahead, Tom. Go ahead. Finish your thought.
Oh, I said so, but I think that in the end, the global economy will be on the rise again within the next couple of months. So as long as people are consuming, ports will live because they are handling these cargo flows.
Lance, you told me something really interesting about what happened to port business at the Port of Los Angeles from March until about June. Can you recap that for our audience so they get a sense of, if we're using ports as a barometer, of where the economy is?
Yeah. So at the beginning of the pandemic, first few months, March, April, May, here in the United States, there was a significant drop in cargo volume. But it came roaring back in the second half of the year, where our overall cargo volume was, I think, our third best year ever. So it did come strong in the second half of the year.
This is a quick question. It's a quick question, quick response. This is from Raphael Cal-E-Mayer. I'm going to give this one to you, Alan. Would it be possible, do you think, to establish an express lane for COVID vaccine?
The expectation is a lot of the vaccine will go by air cargo. which is as fast a transport mode as we have. I saw one calculation estimated that distributing vaccine globally, because it's only produced obviously in certain places in the world, would require, I think it's about 7 or 8,000 737s of air cargo capacity. So, the question is, do we have that capacity and on the right routes to do it? So I think, yeah, to my mind, going back to the more general issue about the logistics of vaccine distribution, we've got political, logistical, and medical factors all entangled here. And distribution of it is going to be constrained as much, I think, by politics and vaccine nationalism as it is by the capacity of the freight transport system as well. And also gets back to what Margie was saying about the particular vaccines that are used, because some can be distributed at ambient temperature. I think Moderna is at -20. I think the Pfizer is -80. So the logistical challenges vary enormously depending on the particular mix of vaccines we send to different parts of the world. But I wouldn't imagine, Tom and Lance, that much vaccine will be going by sea. I mean, I think it's predominantly going to be the air freight sector which will be affected.
That's true for the moment. But as a port, we received the GDP compliance status, I think, a month or two ago. So we're actually the first port on the globe, a seaport, with that kind of status. So GDP means good distribution practices. So we are capable of handling and securing medical and vaccines, medical equipment and vaccines in the best way. So I think there is a possibility to shift from air freight to sea freight because it will be more sustainable. Of course, it requires better planning, proper planning, but in the end, it will be cheaper.
So, speakers, I am going to give you 30 seconds to do this. All right, 30 seconds each. The future of supply chains, or you can choose a trend or a disruptive technology. What would you commit to in 30 seconds and why? Just an instant way to end this session and to be a little provocative for our audience. Lance, what are you going to pick?
Well, I think digitization and cybersecurity for sure are going to both continue to grow significantly, accelerate over the next, into the future. Both areas need to be looked at equally.
Margi, what's your prediction?
Well, I think I have to look at the reason why we move goods is to serve people. So if the pandemic has highlighted anything, it's highlighted the fragilities of the current system. And over and above the COVID deaths that we've experienced, families reported facing starvation and likely to die daily as a result of COVID-related impacts to their livelihoods is up to 12,000 deaths per day due to hunger. So over and above the COVID response, I think that digitization that enables us to share data, to reduce transit times and to serve society better, also with more environmental focus because we're measuring more, is where I would put my money. And I'm certainly hopeful that collaboration will enable that.
Thank you, Margi. Tom?
I think that one of the future trends will be working with the digital twin because it will help port operators to reduce the complexity of the ecosystem, and it will allow port staff to have a very clear view on what is happening in a vast area.
Thank you, Tom. Alan, ending where we started.
Okay, yes. I tend to look at long-term supply chain trends through a decarbonisation lens. There are now, I think, 1,100 companies, big companies in many cases in the world, committed to being net zero carbon by 2050 or earlier. And that covers their supply chains as well. The International Transport Forum's projecting a threefold growth in ton kilometres worldwide by 2050 on a business as usual basis. How do we square that circle? How are we going to minimise those emissions? That, for me, is going to be the real challenge we will have.
Thank you so much, Alan and Margi and Tom and Lance, for your time today. Really appreciate your plenary and your thoughts and your expertise. Take care, everybody.